little background before this story begins. My friend named Laura and I have been interested in the paranormal for a very long time. Ever since the 2nd grade, we have both experienced many paranormal things between the both of us. Laura saw orbs, and her dog would bark at her bookshelf. I, however, heard my dog bark, even though she's been dead for 8 years. I've also on one occasion seen a beautiful white person standing at my door in the middle of the night. Whatever, that's enough backstory. Let's get into it. I was never allowed to have a Ouija board. My family's not religious, and neither is Laura's, but these boards were considered satanic in both of our families. She was eventually allowed to have one though, so in 8th grade about 7 months ago, I bought one and shipped it to her house. I went over to her house the next week after, and got it there. I also bought a candle and a Bible. I also brought my laptop as well to record any voices or noises that we couldn't hear. At first, we felt fearless, but once we started, I felt really off, like someone was sitting in the corner of her room, staring at us. The candle closet to that corner started to flicker once we put our hands on the planchette. The lights were off and we looked up what we were supposed to do, since we didn't want Laura's house becoming a ghost safe zone. After that, we continued on. We asked the usual question, "Is anyone there?" Slowly, the planchette began to move towards a letter instead of yes. I sure as hell wasn't moving it, and Laura didn't look like she was moving it either. We both got really scared, but continued until it reached the letter S. It then began moving towards yes, or so we thought. It slowly and harshly moved towards the letter A instead of yes. At this moment, we both freaked the fuck out, but still kept our hands on the planchette. It began to move towards the letter T, or V, but we didn't know what. Before it moved to the desired letter, we both heard a creak coming from her closet. We couldn't see anything, but we both felt a figure was hiding in the corner. At that moment, I felt something blow on my neck, and my hair moved towards my face. My neck immediately felt cold. At that point, we both screamed and forced the planchette to move towards goodbye. I was shaking after this, and she just kept saying "what the fuck" over and over again. A few minutes later, we went back to the board and we asked the same question. But soon after, I heard a scream come from outside of Laura's window. But oddly enough, she didn't hear it. I freaked out immediately and once again forced the planchette to goodbye. A few moments later, we were back to the board. We asked the same question once again, getting the same response as the first time. S, A, and before it moved to T and V, that's where I asked it, "Is this Satan moving the planchette?" Instead of finishing its original thought, it immediately moved to no. We both breathed a sigh of relief and asked it, "Who is this then?" After this, the planchette didn't move, but for some reason, at that moment my mind was filled with murderous thoughts. But I was smarter than those thoughts, and we said goodbye yet again. We were done with the board this time. We were way too afraid of it. A few days after the fact, I called Laura and told her, "Apparently you aren't supposed to say goodbye too many times, because this still allows the spirits to come out of the board." We were both quiet after this, until Laura let out a quiet yip as she heard something fall in the kitchen, even though she was home alone. A lot of crazy shit has happened since then, but those deserve their own separate stories. We haven't touched a board since then, but Laura did try the board with another friend about a week ago. No one showed up though. I feel lucky that I wasn't possessed, or worse. I also feel lucky that this story had a better ending than some of the other Ouija board stories that I've heard so far. If there's a lesson to learn, do your research before using one of these boards. If something terrible happens, throw it away somewhere far from your home, but don't burn it. Burning it releases the spirits. Have a great day, and be cautious, because you never know who you're going to end up talking to. This is hands down the most terrifying moment of my life. I realize that not everyone believes in this kind of stuff, and I honestly don't know that I believe in it either. All I know is what I saw and felt in a few split seconds. About 7 years ago, I was visiting my cousins on Long Island. It was a normal suburban neighborhood. I was the oldest there at about 12 years old, but no one was younger than 8. I had used Ouija boards before with my siblings and friends, and I always just thought they were a fun game. Nothing serious had ever happened to me up until that point. So we're hanging out, eating pizza, playing video games, when my cousin Lauren, who was just a few months younger than me, suggested that we try out their Ouija board, and I agreed instantly. I'd always thought of myself as brave and logical, and I always kept my cool when those around me were spooked. My younger sister, though, and Lauren's younger brother took some convincing, but eventually we all ended up upstairs in her bedroom with the lights off, sitting on the floor in a circle around the board. When we started, it was twilight, so some natural light filtered through the windows. I remember it had been a hot day, and it was cooling off a bit at the time, but I'm certain it was still above 70 degrees. So we started off with your usual questions. Is anyone there? Followed by yes. Then, what's your name? How old were you when you died? Etc. I guess the responses were pretty unremarkable, as none of them really stood out in my memory. But after about 15 or 20 minutes, things changed. The responses had been slow at first, and I think they had supposedly been coming from a little girl who had drowned or been choked or something. A little creepy, but I remember I was having a good time, and the mood was light. My cousin's bedroom had pink walls with posters of pop stars. Her dresser was covered with cute little toys and knickknacks. There were stuffed animals all over the place, for Christ's sake. Then the response to one of our questions was cut off, and the planchette began to slide to a bunch of random letters and numbers. At first, we were confused and a bit frustrated. We started complaining to each other, but suddenly, we all just stopped talking. What happened next in that room, I simply cannot explain. I guess that the first thing that happened was that I became aware of the fact that it was no longer twilight, it was now late dusk, and though the room was not pitch black, it was dark. Dark enough so that everyone's faces were shrouded in shadows. The pink room all of a sudden felt threatening, and I struggled to hold my cool and unaffected demeanor. It was silent, goosebumps pricked up on my arm, and my eyes slowly adjusted to the dark. And before I realized my eyes were fixated on Lauren's dark face, she was looking behind me. Her eyes were wide and terrified, and she whispered, "Do you see it?" That was what got me. The next few seconds were stark horror as I've never felt it. I was completely frozen in fear and didn't want to look around. I felt like every stuffed animal and poster was watching me angrily, and the room itself was coldly mocking me. I felt like as soon as I looked at whatever it was she was seeing, it would attack me or something. So I just kept looking at the board. Our younger siblings were turning their heads wildly. That's when Lauren pointed, and they all screamed bloody murder simultaneously. All three of them scrambled up and bolted for the door, which they struggled to open for a moment. But they finally got it open and ran downstairs still screaming. Now, I was alone in the room, and for a second, I thought I was going to pass out. At last, I forced myself to look behind me and I jerkily dashed out of the room as fast as I damn well could, because there, in the window, was an all-black silhouette of a man's head looking in. As soon as I ran downstairs, I felt completely fine, but the fresh memory of that mindless terror was no less real. Our parents told us that it was definitely not a head that we saw, but we all knew on an almost instinctual level that it definitely was. Lauren had not said, "Look, it's a head." She said, "Do you see it?" And we had each individually concluded that it was a head. No features had been visible because it was so dark, but we had felt it watching us. That could have been part of what had created that horrible tension. The creepiest part is that Lauren's bedroom is on the second floor, so it couldn't have been a neighbor or somebody trying to mess with us. Whatever it was had practically been pressing its nose against the glass. To this day, I have never felt anything like I did in that room. We all simultaneously had the same reaction of adrenaline, panic, and blinding fear. I was never easily frightened back then, but god damn it, that shit was unnaturally scary. Here's a paranormal story told to me many times by my mother. When my mom was a teenager, she went to a friend's house for a sleepover. We'll call her Ashley. It was her and 3 other girls. Ashley's parents were out for the night, but were recording a movie on the TV in the living room. So the girls decided to stay in Ashley's room. One of the girls, we'll call her Sarah, was pretty dark and thought it would be fun to bring a Ouija board. Now, my mom had a previous shocking Ouija board experience, but clearly she hadn't learned her lesson. So the girls begin pushing the planchette around, of course convinced the entire time that the others were pushing it. After a while of playing around, they finally got a spirit, asking it stupid questions like, "Can you prove you're here?" After asking the same question for a while, it finally agreed and the TV in their room went out. This was the 80s, so it was one of those old box TVs. The kind where you turn it on and the picture starts as a small dot in the middle of the screen and then quickly fills the entire space. Well, when the TV came back on, it literally looked like someone was pushing the picture in from the side. They all freaked out because this was definitely not normal. Luckily, some guy friends stopped over at this time and then dragged out the girls to the mall. The girls then proceeded to tell the guys what had just happened, but of course, they didn't believe them. After some time had passed, they got back to Ashley's house and they wanted to prove that they were telling the truth. They then remembered that the same movie that they were watching was being recorded, so they checked the recording to see if the screen was also pushed in from the side. Maybe it was just a glitch in the program. It wasn't. They went back to Ashley's room and used the Ouija board once again to try to get the same spirit from earlier to show the guys that they were telling the truth. They finally got the same spirit and asked if it could show itself. It replied yes to this, and then they asked if it could do the TV trick again. To this, it replied no. They then began asking it the same questions, hoping that it would recreate the same situation from earlier. The questions continued this way until they got impatient and finally asked. It then quickly started spelling something. It went along the lines of K-I-L. My mom then realized what it was trying to spell and threw the board over before it could finish. She knew that if it finished spelling the word kill, it would indeed fulfill its promise. The girls then began freaking out once again and gave the board to the guys to get rid of. Of course, they didn't believe what was happening anyway, so the guys took the board and left. The girls then decided that the best course of action would be just to relax and go to sleep. They then laid down in Ashley's room and turned the lights off. Everything's quiet, and they're almost asleep when all of a sudden, the lights turned back on. The girls were frozen and just looked at each other. They tried to come up with an explanation, and Sarah immediately turned the lights back off. A couple of minutes after, everything settled once again, and Sarah laid back down. But as soon as she did, the lights popped on again. They began debating on whether or not they should turn the lights off again, or just stay up until dawn. They all decided to stay up and talk and play other games to get their minds off of what had just happened. Time had passed, and just as they finally got their minds off of it, the lights went out. They all screamed, and Sarah jumped up to immediately turn the lights on. Again, a few minutes later, the lights went out once again. This time, all of the girls got up and went to go turn the light on. At this point, they were all panicking and trying their best to get this situation out of their minds. But just as they were relaxing, the lights went out a third time. That was it. They were not going to be able to stay. They called the guys from earlier and went out to party the rest of the night. There was no way that sleep was happening that night. Whenever my mom tells this story, she's just so thankful that nothing worse happened. She truly believes that the spirit they contacted could have easily locked the house up and kept them from leaving. After that, she could only imagine what would have happened. To this day, she still lays in bed sometimes, wondering what she would do if the lights were to turn on or off. To make matters even worse, years later when I was in high school, we were both laying in bed, reading books, and she has one of those lamps, when you touch it, it gets brighter and brighter. It has about 3 settings before going off again. Anyways, we're laying there reading, when all of a sudden, the light flickers. This grabbed our attention. Next, the light turns off, back onto the brightest setting, then goes down through the settings, only not from lowest to highest. It went backwards. These things can't do that. Finally, after going backwards through the settings, it stopped on the setting it was originally on. Me and my mom immediately looked at each other, and at the same time we suggested going out for dinner. This hasn't happened since then, and the lamp works perfectly fine. It gives me chills to this day. Although I didn't personally experience the original occurrence, I too lay in bed, frightened over the thought that the lights might just switch off. I've always been infatuated with the idea of ghosts and the paranormal. For as long as I can remember, I've always been watching all of the ghost and Bigfoot hunting shows. I wanted to be one of the ghost hunters when I grew up, but my opinions quickly changed after the span of 1 week. I had a school project in my world geography class to map out all of the Indian tribes' territory in the US. I found out that I lived in a past territory of the Apache tribe, which I partly expected because I am 1/4 Apache. Of course, I kept researching the Apache after the project had ended and learned all that I could about the tribe. I soon learned after that the Apache also believed in ghosts in the afterlife, as I do. Of course, being the stupid 11-year-old that I was, I decided to steal my father's Ouija board to see if there were any lingering spirits in my house. I soon decided that the time I would speak to any spirits was the Saturday that I stole the board. That night came quickly, and I was excited to see if I could find any ghost that would be willing to talk to me and tell me about my tribe. I set up the board, lit candles all around myself, and turned off the lights in my room. I was ready. I first asked, "Is anyone there?" To my shock, I was immediately signed hello. I was ecstatic. Someone was with me. I asked if they were Apache, and they answered yes, and then began to tell me that his name was Delshay, the name for a warrior and a chief. I was asking questions all night, up until he gave me a very, very bone-chilling answer that didn't relate to the question that I even asked. "Can you help me?" the board spelled out. Of course, I happily obliged to this question. He then told me to put up my board, saying that there were other spirits coming. "Don't say goodbye," the board spelled. I remember I was a little confused as to why I would have said goodbye in the first place, but I just did what he said, and the week that followed was one of the scariest of my life. 3 days later, as I was doing my math homework, I heard a knock coming from the inside of my closet. I laughed and told my brother to come out, but as I did so, I heard his door open, and then he proceeded to open my door leading into my room and told me I didn't knock. This freaked me out a little bit, but I didn't think much of the incident. We lived in a pretty run-down house at the time, so I just chalked it up to that. Throughout the week though, more strange things began happening. Doors would slam in the middle of the night, cabinets would open and close, and some things would seemingly disappear without a trace, only later to be found in the place we checked first. I began worrying that me not saying goodbye to Delshay was a horrible idea. I stole my father's Ouija board once again and searched for Delshay, but this time I couldn't get an answer back from him. I knew then, in that moment, that I had invited Delshay to haunt my house. I told my brother what had happened, and he decided that we needed to signal Delshay and let him pass on to the other side. We turned off all the lights in my room, lit candles, and tried our best to get a hold of him. We attempted to copy everything the ghost hunters did. We started the recorder and began talking. The first question my brother asked was, "If you're here, give us a sign." Then something absolutely terrifying happened. My closet door began to open. Slowly, very slowly. All we could do was hear the hinges squeak. I was absolutely frozen in fear, and I assumed my brother was as well. We sat in silence for at least 10 minutes before we heard something. We heard a faded whisper say, "Deal." At this, my brother and I were shocked. We quickly cleared everything in my room and ran to my parents to tell them what had just happened. My parents believed in ghosts just as much as I did. We even showed them the tape of the door slowly opening and Delshay's comment. We were already planning on moving from the run-down home, so this just added to the list of reasons for wanting to move from the now haunted house. We did move soon after, and I don't know what happened to the house or Delshay, but I can tell you this for certain: don't ever forget to say goodbye